Okay, we are back for part three of tissues. So we're going to go ahead and finish up this lecture with our muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and then we'll talk briefly about the different types of membranes found in the body. All right, so muscle tissue's job is to contract and shorten with force, and this allows movement in different ways. So we have skeletal muscle. So of course, our bodybuilder here is moving the weight with the skeletal muscle. We have cardiac muscle found in the heart, and then we have smooth muscle found in places like the respiratory system, our blood vessels, and the digestive system. All right, first we'll talk about skeletal muscle. And when we talk about our three different muscle types, there's really two main designations that we can give each type. And just with those two words, you should be able to figure out which type we are talking about. So the first characteristic is whether it's striated or non-striated. So striated means striped or banded. And so for our first one, for skeletal muscle, our fibers are striated. So you can see in our textbook picture here, we have these bands of light and dark, and it's a little tougher to see on our microscope slide, but you can still see there's lighter and darker stain. And so that's the two different types of muscle fibers. And so our skeletal muscle is striated, and then the other part of this is that it is voluntary. So we get to turn on or choose to use our skeletal muscle. And you will see that skeletal muscle is the only type of muscle tissue that is voluntary. Our two other types of muscle tissue, smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, we cannot control. And so this is going to attach to our bones or attached to connective tissue. So most of the time we're attaching to the bone somehow, but a lot of times there's going to be connective tissue between the muscle and the bone, like a tendon. All right, our cardiac muscle. And so again, our cells are striated. And so uh, these are going to have a couple other unique features as well. So one thing, and let me go back for just a second. Besides being striated, you see our skeletal muscle lines up in these nice straight bands, and our nuclei tend to get pushed to the edges of these bands. So this one's pretty zoomed in. So we only see three nuclei here. If we had this on a little less of a magnification, sometimes you can see almost like a whole row of nuclei lined up across these different fibers. For cardiac muscle, one of the unique features is branches. And so we can see a little more space and light in our cardiac muscle slide. So that's one way to tell. In this case, the striations aren't quite as prominent, but that's just has to do with the way it's stained. And we can see these branches or extensions that connect the cells to one another. If I go back to skeletal muscle, you don't see any tissue here. There's no branching from one muscle cell to the other, one muscle fiber to the other. So this is another good time to point out that one muscle cell is known as a muscle fiber. So a muscle cell is known as a muscle fiber, and that's any type of muscle tissue. Another feature is intercalated discs, and this is a special type of gap junction. And so this darker band here is referring to an intercalated disc. And so these are special gap junctions between our cardiac cells, and it's going to let ions pass very quickly. And that's kind of what we mentioned when we talked about gap junctions up in the beginning of our presentation. And so both branches and intercalated discs are very important for cardiac muscle because our heart has a very specific rhythm. And your heartbeat goes lub dub, lub dub. And that's because all the cells in our atria are beating as one, and then all the muscle fibers in our ventricles are beating as one. And having those branches and intercalated discs help all of our muscle fibers stay on the same page. So when one activates, all of them are going to activate together. And so, of course, we only find these in our heart. It's involuntary now because We don't get to decide when our heart is going to beat. So for skeletal muscle, we had striated and voluntary. Now for cardiac muscle, we have striated but involuntary. And then our last is smooth muscle. And so smooth muscle is smooth, it's non-striated. It's going to regulate the size of our organs somewhat. It can help move our fluid through our vessels or control where our blood flows in our arteries by widening or dilating or narrowing or constricting. It controls the pupil and iris, so that's going to control the amount of light entering the eye. Our erector pili muscle in the skin is going to be a smooth muscle. We'll talk about that next chapter. And of course, all of these are involuntary. And one of the main things it does is move food through the digestive system. So that's one of the main locations we touch on here. So that's what's churning up the food in your stomach and then moving it through your intestines is smooth muscle. These cells are quite long and they kind of taper at each end. It's like a really long diamond, and they're only going to have one nuclei per muscle cell. All right, our nervous tissue. All right, we basically have two different types of cells. We have neurons, which actually receive and send signals, and then we have the glial cells or neuroglia. And our glia are really there just to support and help the function of our neurons. But our glia don't actually send those action potentials or nerve impulses themselves. That's only the neurons. All right, we're going to talk about the parts of the neuron. And so the main portion here that contains the nucleus is the cell body. And so you can see that our neuron is very similar to what we see on our slide here. So we have our body with the nucleus. Most of the neurons in our body have this type of setup where we're going to have multiple dendrites. These are the branches that receive impulses. And then this is our axon. And so the axon is going to be what sends action potentials away from the neuron. That's going to the next neuron or structure. And so that's the word for nerve impulse is action potential. That's that electrical signal traveling down the axon. And so depending on the neuron, really its job is to detect a signal and then integrate that information, evaluate what it means to our body, and then decide what to do about it. And we're also going to store that information so that we know how to react if that same thing happens again. And then, of course, this is going to be our brain and our spinal cord. We refer to that as our central nervous system. And then all of our nerves that branch off of the brain and spinal cord, we refer to as our peripheral nervous system. So you guys should be able to identify these different parts here. And then on the slide itself, all these little blue dots are different glial cells. One of our glial cells is called a Schwann cell, and that actually is what's wrapping this axon. It acts like an insulator. I think you'd almost never see just bare wire exposed. It almost always has a plastic covering. And that's because that helps it not lose ions. It makes it much more efficient. Same thing for our nerves. Our Schwann cells here help keep all the sodium and potassium within our axon so that it can travel quickly down that axon. All right, last little piece is membranes. And so a membrane, all of our membranes are thin sheets of tissue, and they're going to either cover a structure or line a cavity. And so this is actually going back to epithelial tissue and connective tissue. So just like our skin, it's made of epithelial tissue with underlying connective tissue. And you'll see we have three different types of membranes in the body, really four if you count our cutaneous membrane, which is the skin. We have mucous membranes, and so those are located when we have openings to the body, like our respiratory and digestive systems. Serous membranes, we talked about some in Unit 1. So depending on the organ, they're named a little different. So for our lungs, we have the pleural cavities, and then in the abdominal cavity, we have the peritoneal cavity. And these are our openings or cavities that don't open to the external environment. Then we have synovial membranes, which we find in our freely movable joints, our diarthritic joints. And so that's going to help lubricate our joints and prevent friction along with hyaline cartilage. So I just said a lot of this, but we'll run through it again. And so our mucous membranes are going to line those cavities that open to the outside of the body. And we have goblet cells, which are typically either a columnar or cuboidal cell that secrete mucus. And so one thing it's going to do is protect. So these open to the external environment. We have dust and bacteria and viruses and other substances wanting to try to get into the body. And that mucus provides an environment that's not so ideal that can kind of catch some of those invaders. They can also absorb or secrete. So that's another function, and that goes along with our cuboidal and columnar cells as well. So that makes sense. Our serous membranes, we said these do not open to the exterior. And remember, these have two layers. So our layer that is going to make contact with our organs is our visceral layer. The layer that is just on the outer portion of the membrane or the cavity is going to be the parietal layer. So visceral always means organ. So anytime you see the word visceral, it's referring to an organ. So you can remember the visceral membrane or for example, for our lungs, the visceral pleural membrane is directly on the surface of the lung. The parietal pleural membrane is what is going to surround that pleural cavity. And then in between our two layers of our serous membrane, we find serous fluid, and that prevents friction between our two layers and it helps protect the organs. And then last, we have synovial membranes. These are going to line our freely movable joints. They produce a slippery fluid. It's kind of like lubrication for the joints, and it's called synovial fluid. And it just helps reduce friction and facilitate smooth movement. And so synovial fluid, the synovial membrane, and the hyaline cartilage all help to prevent friction within our joints. All right, guys, thank you for listening. I know that was a long one, and so we will move on to chapter 5.